Everyone walked past, but a poor black girl saved him. Unknown to her, he was a millionaire. The sound of her own stomach growling had become Tasha's most faithful companion, a cruel metronome marking the rhythm of another day without hope, until she saw him bleeding on the cold concrete, abandoned by a world that had already abandoned her. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The pre-dawn chill of Chicago cut through Tasha Williams' threadbare jacket like a blade, each gust of October wind carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant aroma of fresh bread from bakeries she could never afford to enter. At 23, her dark eyes held depths that spoke of struggles far beyond her years, yet they still sparked with a defiance that poverty hadn't managed to extinguish. She pushed her shopping cart, a rickety thing with one wheel that stubbornly refused to roll straight, down the empty sidewalk of Michigan Avenue. The cart held everything she owned: a sleeping bag that had seen better decades, 2 changes of clothes wrapped in plastic bags, a water bottle with a crack running down its side, and a manila folder containing the most precious thing she possessed: immigration papers that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into a bureaucratic maze. The city was just beginning to stir. Street sweepers hummed their mechanical lullabies while early commuters emerged from the warmth of their cars, clutching coffee cups like talismans against the morning cold. None of them looked at her. She had learned that people had a remarkable ability to see right through someone like her, as if poverty had rendered her invisible. Tasha's mind drifted back to Port-au-Prince, to the small house with blue shutters where her grandmother had taught her to braid hair and speak English. "You have strong hands, Tasha," Grandma would say, guiding her small fingers through another woman's hair. "Strong hands and a big heart. That will take you far in America." If only Grandma could see her now. The earthquake had taken everything: the house, her grandmother, her entire world. The American family she'd worked for as a nanny had sponsored her visa, promising to help her start over. But when their own financial troubles hit, those promises evaporated faster than morning dew. Now, 3 years later, she was caught in an endless cycle of expired documents, missed appointments, and lawyers who demanded retainers she could never afford. She paused at the corner of State and Madison, watching the early morning joggers with their pristine running shoes and wireless earbuds. Their faces held the particular kind of focus that came from having places to be, people who cared whether they arrived. Tasha couldn't remember the last time someone had been waiting for her anywhere. The morning crowd was thickening. Business people in pressed suits hurried past, their leather shoes clicking against the pavement in staccato rhythms. A woman in a camel coat walked by talking loudly into her phone about quarterly projections, completely oblivious to Tasha's presence just 3 feet away. What would it feel like, Tasha wondered, to have problems that could be solved with spreadsheets and meetings? She had worked, oh, how she had worked. Cleaning offices at night, babysitting for cash, anything that didn't require the papers she couldn't get. But without legal status, she was trapped in an economy of shadows, always one paycheck away from disaster, always one accident away from homelessness. The accident had come in the form of a landlord who discovered her immigration status and decided she wasn't worth the risk. Now, 2 months later, the streets were her address, and survival was her full-time job. The financial district began to come alive around her. Glass towers stretched toward the cloudy sky like fingers of steel and ambition, their windows reflecting a world of prosperity that felt as distant as her homeland. Men and women streamed from parking garages and subway entrances, their expressions set in the determined masks of the professionally successful. Among them walked Vincent Harrington, though Tasha had no way of knowing his name or the fact that the sleek silver BMW he'd emerged from cost more than most people made in 2 years. At 45, Vincent carried himself with the particular bearing of a man who had never had to wonder where his next meal would come from. His charcoal grey suit was perfectly tailored, his Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of precision, control, success. But today, something was different about Vincent's usual routine. Usually, his morning walk from the parking garage to his office was a time of mental preparation, reviewing the day's meetings and deals in his mind. Today, his thoughts kept drifting to the phone call he'd received the night before, his sister calling to tell him about his ex-wife's remarriage, about how happy she seemed, about how her new husband treated Vincent's own daughter like she was precious. "She asks about you sometimes," his sister had said. "Emma, she wonders why her daddy doesn't call anymore." The custody battle had been brutal, expensive, and ultimately futile. When the judge awarded primary custody to his ex-wife, citing his excessive focus on work and financial success over family relationships, Vincent had told himself it was for the best. Emma would be better off without a father who was always traveling, always in meetings, always choosing business over bedtime stories. But walking through the early morning crowd, watching other parents drop off their children at nearby schools, he couldn't shake the hollow feeling that he'd made the greatest mistake of his life. Vincent's law firm occupied the 32nd through 34th floors of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. Harrington, Stone and Associates specialized in high-stakes corporate litigation, and Vincent's reputation for winning impossible cases had made him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. His penthouse apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, his garage housed 3 cars, and his investment portfolio could have funded a small country's budget. Yet somehow, success felt increasingly like a beautifully appointed prison. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the 3 men following him. Almost. Vincent had survived long enough in Chicago's legal jungle to develop an instinct for danger. The first warning came as a prickle at the base of his neck, that primitive alarm that had kept humans alive for millennia. The second warning was catching the same face twice in his peripheral vision, once reflected in a storefront window, again in the side mirror of a parked car. He quickened his pace slightly, taking a detour down a side street that led away from the main thoroughfare. His heart rate elevated, but his mind stayed calm, calculating. These weren't random muggers. Random muggers didn't wear suits and coordinate their movements with military precision. The narrow alley between 2 office buildings was dimly lit, lined with dumpsters and service entrances. It was also, Vincent realized too late, a perfect place for an ambush. They moved fast. The first man came from behind, wrapping a muscled arm around Vincent's throat. The second grabbed his briefcase. The third, who seemed to be in charge, spoke in a voice that was all business. "Mr. Harrington, you cost our client a very expensive verdict last month. $37 million, to be exact." Vincent struggled against the arm at his throat, his expensive shoes skidding on the wet pavement. "If you want money." "We don't want your money," the leader interrupted. "We want you to remember that some cases aren't worth winning." The beating was professional, calculated. They knew exactly how to hurt him without causing permanent damage, how to send a message that would be remembered but not reported. Vincent's perfectly pressed suit tore. His Italian shoes scraped against concrete. His briefcase scattered its contents across the dirty alley. When they were done, he lay crumpled against a brick wall, tasting blood and regret in equal measure. His ribs ached with each breath, and something warm was trickling down his forehead. But he was alive, and in Chicago's legal underworld, that was often the best outcome you could hope for. The men disappeared as quickly and quietly as they had appeared, leaving Vincent alone in the alley with his pain and the sound of the awakening city just beyond the narrow walls. He tried to stand, made it halfway up, and collapsed again. The world spun like a carnival ride, and darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. His last coherent thought before unconsciousness claimed him was that he should have called Emma more often. Have you ever found yourself helping someone when you had nothing to give? What drives us to show compassion even when we're struggling ourselves? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear about a time when kindness showed up in an unexpected way. The morning rush hour was in full swing when Tasha turned down LaSalle Street, her shopping cart's broken wheel leaving an erratic trail behind her like a drunken snake. She had learned the rhythms of the city's refuse, which office buildings emptied their trash bins early, which restaurants might have day-old bread in their dumpsters, which coffee shops sometimes left pastries outside their back doors. But today, something felt different. The usual symphony of car horns and hurried footsteps seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Tasha pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, the October wind cutting through the fabric like it wasn't there at all. She almost missed him entirely. It was only the glint of something metallic catching the weak morning sun that made her pause at the mouth of the narrow alley between 2 towering office buildings. At first, she thought it might be coins scattered on the pavement, wishful thinking born from too many days when a quarter could mean the difference between hunger and a small meal. But as her eyes adjusted to the alley's dim light, she saw it wasn't coins at all. Papers were scattered across the wet concrete like fallen leaves, their corners lifting in the breeze. A leather briefcase lay on its side, its contents spilled in a wide arc. And there, crumpled against the brick wall like a discarded doll, was a man. Tasha's first instinct was to keep walking. In her world, Unconscious men in alleyways usually meant trouble, drugs, violence, or worse. She had learned to navigate around danger, to make herself small and invisible when the streets turned threatening. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way his hand was stretched out, palm up, fingers slightly curled as if he'd been reaching for something just out of grasp. Maybe it was the expensive fabric of his torn suit, so out of place in this forgotten corner of the city. Or maybe it was the small, dark stain spreading slowly beneath his head, too red to be anything but blood. "Shit," she whispered, the word torn from her lips by a combination of fear and recognition. This wasn't some street addict sleeping off a high. This was someone who belonged in the world of glass towers and quarterly reports. Someone who had fallen as far and as hard as she had, just in a different way. She looked around nervously. The alley was empty except for a few pigeons pecking at something near a dumpster. The sounds of the morning commute continued just yards away, but here in this narrow space between buildings, they might as well have been on another planet. Every survival instinct she'd developed over the past 2 months screamed at her to walk away. Getting involved with an unconscious white man in an expensive suit was exactly the kind of situation that could land someone like her in jail, or worse. The police wouldn't ask questions first. They'd see a homeless black woman standing over an injured businessman and draw their own conclusions. But as she started to turn away, he made a sound. It was barely more than a whisper, a soft groan that spoke of pain and confusion, and something that sounded heartbreakingly like a child calling for his mother. The sound stopped Tasha cold, her hand frozen on her shopping cart's handle. She knew that sound. She had made it herself on too many nights, when the shelters were full and the streets were cold and the weight of being utterly alone in the world pressed down like a physical thing. It was the sound of someone who had reached the absolute limit of what they could endure. "Damn it," she muttered, abandoning her cart and stepping into the alley. The man was older than she'd first thought, probably in his 40s, with greying temples visible beneath the blood that had matted his dark hair. His face was swollen on one side, and there was a cut above his left eye that was still bleeding sluggishly. But it was his expression that made her chest tighten. Even unconscious, he looked lost. Tasha knelt beside him, careful not to touch him yet. She had learned basic first aid from a kind nurse at a free clinic, back when she still had hope that someone would help her navigate the immigration system. Check for responsiveness first, the nurse had taught her. Then breathing. Then bleeding. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. His breathing was shallow but steady. The bleeding from his head wound had mostly stopped, but there was something about the way he was lying that suggested other injuries. Maybe ribs, maybe internal damage she couldn't see. She pulled out her cracked phone, the screen spiderwebbed from too many drops on concrete. No signal. Of course there was no signal. The alley seemed designed to cut them off from the rest of the world, a pocket of isolation in the heart of one of America's busiest cities. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to him. "Okay, think, Tasha. Think." She could leave him here and find help. Walk back to the street, find a police officer, or call 911 from someone else's phone. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But it was also the thing that would take time, and something about the grey pallor of his skin told her time wasn't something they had in abundance. Instead, she did something that defied every lesson the streets had taught her about self-preservation. She stayed. From her cart, she retrieved her water bottle and a relatively clean t-shirt. The water was precious. She had to refill it at public fountains and couldn't always count on finding them. But looking at this broken man, she couldn't think of a better use for it. "This is going to be cold," she warned him, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "But we need to clean this cut." She wet a corner of the shirt and gently dabbed at the wound on his forehead. The blood washed away in pink rivulets, revealing a cut that was deep but not as bad as all the blood had made it seem. Head wounds bled dramatically, she remembered the nurse saying. They looked worse than they were. As she worked, she found herself talking to him, her voice low and soothing. "You're going to be okay. I don't know who did this to you, but you're going to be okay. My name's Tasha. I found you here, and I'm not going to leave you alone." It was then that his eyes opened. They were blue, not the pale, washed-out blue of winter sky, but deep and clear like the ocean she remembered from pictures in her grandmother's old National Geographic magazines. For a moment, they stared at her with complete confusion, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. "Where?" he started, then winced as speaking sent pain shooting through what were probably bruised ribs. You're in an alley off LaSalle, Tasha said gently. Someone hurt you pretty bad. Do you remember what happened? Vincent, though she still didn't know his name, tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The world tilted dangerously, and for a moment, he thought he might vomit. But what struck him more than the pain was the face looking down at him with such genuine concern. She was young, probably mid-20s, with dark skin and intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience he couldn't fathom. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore clothes that had seen better years but were clean and carefully maintained. There was something about her that radiated strength and kindness in equal measure. But what confused him most was why she was here at all. You should go, he managed to say, his voice rough and unclear. This isn't. You shouldn't be involved in this. Tasha sat back on her heels, studying his face. Even beaten and bloody, there was something aristocratic about his features, a kind of refined bearing that spoke of good schools and better opportunities. His suit, she noticed now, was expertly tailored. The watch on his wrist, the one that hadn't been stolen, probably cost more than she'd ever seen in one place. Maybe I shouldn't be, she agreed. But here I am anyway. She helped him shift into a more comfortable position, propping him against the brick wall so he could sit up without falling over. The movement sent waves of pain through his body, but it also cleared his head enough to really look at her. You're homeless, he said, and immediately regretted the bluntness of the observation. Tasha's jaw tightened slightly, but her expression remained compassionate. That's right. And you stopped to help me. That's right too. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. In his world, the world of corporate law and high-stakes negotiations, people didn't do things without expecting something in return. Every kindness had a price, every favor came with strings attached. But this young woman had used her own precious water to clean his wounds, had stayed with him when she could have simply walked away. Why? He asked finally. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Tasha could have given him any number of answers, because it was the right thing to do, because she'd want someone to help her, because her grandmother had raised her to believe that kindness was never wasted. All of those would have been true. Instead, she said simply, because everyone else walked past. The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. He thought of all the times he'd hurried past homeless people on his way to important meetings, all the times he'd looked through them as if they were part of the urban landscape rather than human beings with stories and struggles and dreams. He thought of the morning commuters who had probably passed this very alley, too busy or too afraid or too indifferent to investigate. Everyone else walked past. But she hadn't. What's your name? He asked. Tasha. Tasha Williams. She paused, then added, What's yours? Vincent. Vincent Harrington. Neither of them recognized the other's name, though in different circumstances, they might have. Tasha might have seen Vincent's face in the business section of newspapers she sometimes used for warmth. Vincent might have noticed Tasha among the homeless people he passed on his way to work, if he had ever really looked. But here, in this forgotten alley, they were just two people who had found each other at exactly the moment when they both needed to not be alone. Vincent, Tasha repeated, testing the name. That's a nice name. Strong. My daughter always said it sounded like a fancy restaurant, Vincent said without thinking, then immediately wished he could take the words back. He never talked about Emma, especially not to strangers. But Tasha's face softened with understanding. You have a daughter. Had. Have. It's complicated. Vincent tried to shift position again and gasped as pain shot through his side. I don't see her much anymore. There was something in his voice, a combination of regret and longing that Tasha recognized. She'd heard it in her own voice when she talked about her grandmother, about the life she'd left behind, about all the things that circumstances had taken from her. Family's complicated, she agreed. But it's also precious, even when it's broken. They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers bound together by pain and kindness and the strange intimacy that comes from sharing truth in unexpected places. The morning sun had climbed higher, sending a shaft of light down into the alley that illuminated the scattered papers from Vincent's briefcase. I should call someone for you, Tasha said eventually. The police, or an ambulance, or... No. The word came out sharper than Vincent intended. No police. Tasha studied his face, noting the fear that had flickered across his features. She was familiar with that fear, the knowledge that involving authorities could make a bad situation infinitely worse. Okay, she said simply. No police. Vincent felt a wave of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. In his professional life, people constantly questioned his decisions, demanded explanations, pushed for details. But this young woman, this stranger who had every reason to be suspicious of him, simply accepted his request without argument. "Can you stand?" she asked. "We should get you somewhere safer. This alley, whoever did this might come back." The thought hadn't occurred to Vincent, but as soon as she said it, he realized she was right. The men who had beaten him had been professionals, but professionals could be unpredictable. If they decided he needed a more permanent lesson, this isolated alley would be the perfect place to deliver it. With Tasha's help, he managed to get to his feet, though the world spun dangerously for a moment and he had to lean heavily against the wall. She was stronger than she looked, he realized. There was a wiry toughness to her that spoke of someone who had learned to rely on her own strength. "Where can we go?" he asked. Tasha looked at him, this wealthy, injured stranger who had somehow become her responsibility, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I know a place," she said. "It's not much, but it's safe." Sometimes the most profound moments in our lives come from the kindness of strangers. What do you think drives people to help others when they have nothing to gain and everything to lose? Have you ever been helped by someone unexpected? Tasha's safe place turned out to be a forgotten corner of Millennium Park, hidden behind a maintenance shed where the groundskeepers stored equipment during the off-season. She had discovered it during her first week on the streets, a small alcove formed by the convergence of two concrete walls and an overgrown hedge that provided shelter from both wind and curious eyes. It wasn't much. A piece of cardboard served as flooring, a top stretched between the walls created a makeshift roof, and her few possessions were arranged with the careful precision of someone who had learned that organization was the difference between surviving and thriving when you had nothing. "This is home," she said quietly, helping Vincent settle onto a folded blanket that was cleaner than anything had a right to be in such circumstances. "I know it's not what you're used to, but—" "It's perfect," Vincent interrupted, and was surprised to find he meant it. There was something about the space that felt intentionally created, thoughtfully arranged. Despite having nothing, Tasha had made something. "You did all this?" Tasha nodded, suddenly self-conscious. She had never brought anyone here before. This place was her sanctuary, her one piece of the world that belonged entirely to her. Sharing it felt incredibly vulnerable, like opening her chest and showing someone her heart. "The security guards don't patrol this area much," she explained, pulling a small first aid kit from a plastic bag. "And it's close enough to the public restrooms that I can, you know." She trailed off, embarrassed. The daily logistics of homelessness, finding places to wash, to use the bathroom, to simply exist without being moved along, were not things she typically had to explain to someone in a $1,000 suit. But Vincent was looking at her makeshift home with something that looked like admiration. He had lived in luxury his entire adult life, first in expensive apartments, then in his penthouse overlooking the lake. Every space had been professionally designed, perfectly appointed, magazine-worthy. Yet none of them had ever felt as intentional, as lived in, as this small corner hidden behind a maintenance shed. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "About a month. Before that, I was in a shelter, but—" She opened the first aid kit and began pulling out supplies, antiseptic wipes, bandages, pain medication that was probably over the counter but felt precious in her circumstances. Shelters have rules. Lots of rules. And questions. And forms. The way she said forms told Vincent everything he needed to know. As a lawyer, he was intimately familiar with the bureaucratic maze that could trap people without proper documentation. He had represented enough corporations in immigration matters to understand how the system could grind people up, how a single missing stamp or expired date could render someone invisible, unwelcome, unable to access even the most basic services. "You're undocumented," he said gently. It wasn't a question. Tasha's hands stilled on the antiseptic wipe. She looked up at him with eyes that held a combination of defiance and resignation. "You going to report me?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "No, I'm not." Something in his tone, not pity, not judgment, just acceptance, made her shoulders relax slightly. She began cleaning the cuts on his knuckles, her touch gentle but efficient. "I came here legally," she said after a moment. "Had a visa, had sponsors, had everything right and proper. But when your sponsors decide you're too expensive to keep around, and your visa expires, and you don't have $3,000 for a lawyer who might not even be able to help you. She shrugged. The system's not designed for people like me to succeed. Vincent winced. They whether from her ministrations or her words, he couldn't be sure. $3,000. He spent more than that on a single business dinner. He had probably spent that much on the shoes that were now scuffed and torn from his encounter in the alley. What did you do? He asked. Before. I was a nanny. Took care of 2 little kids while their parents worked. Loved those babies like they were my own. Her voice softened with memory. Emma and Jake. 5 and 3. Emma used to make me these drawings, stick figures of us holding hands, with our names written in purple crayon at the bottom. Vincent's breath caught. Emma. Beautiful little girl. Curly blonde hair and these big blue eyes that saw everything. Smart as a whip, too. She could read chapter books by the time she was 4. Tasha applied a bandage to a particularly deep cut, her movements careful and precise. She used to tell me she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, so she could help people feel better. The coincidence was like a knife to Vincent's chest. His Emma, his daughter who he barely saw anymore, who was growing up with a stepfather who probably tucked her in every night, had the same curly blonde hair, the same blue eyes, the same fierce intelligence. And here was this woman who had loved some other man's children with the kind of devotion that he had never managed to show his own daughter. You miss them, he said. Every day. Tasha's voice was quiet. But missing them is a luxury I can't afford. Missing them won't keep me warm or fed or safe. There was something in the way she said it, a practiced stoicism that spoke of someone who had learned to compartmentalize pain in order to survive. Vincent recognized it because he had done the same thing with his own grief over losing Emma, over the divorce, over the growing certainty that his success had cost him everything that actually mattered. The children I took care of, Tasha continued, taping down the edges of the bandage. When their parents lost their jobs, they couldn't afford to keep me anymore. And without them sponsoring my visa renewal. She made a gesture that encompassed her entire situation. What about your family? Back home? Tasha was quiet for so long that Vincent thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Earthquake took everything. Everyone. I came here with nothing but what someone else thought I was worth. She looked up at him, and he saw something fierce and unbroken in her eyes. But I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And I'm going to find a way to make it work, because giving up isn't an option. The determination in her voice was humbling. Vincent thought about his own problems. The beating, yes, but also the existential crisis that had been building for months, the growing certainty that his life of accumulating wealth and winning cases was ultimately hollow. His problems were real, but they were problems that money could solve. Tasha's problems were the kind that money couldn't touch. Immigration status, systemic inequality, the basic human need to belong somewhere. Tell me about the people who hurt you, Tasha said, changing the subject as she moved to examine a scrape on his temple. You said no police. Why? Vincent hesitated. In his world, admitting vulnerability was dangerous. Showing weakness could cost you clients, cases, respect. But sitting in this makeshift shelter, being tended to by someone who had every reason to be bitter but instead radiated compassion, the usual rules didn't seem to apply. I'm a lawyer, he said. Corporate litigation. I won a case recently that cost some very dangerous people a lot of money. How much money? $37 million. Tasha whistled low. No wonder they wanted to send you a message. They could have killed you. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to scare me. Make me think twice about taking similar cases in the future. Vincent accepted the pain medication she offered, 2 generic ibuprofen, that probably represented a significant portion of her medical supplies. The thing is, it worked. What do you mean? Vincent was quiet for a moment, processing thoughts he had never spoken aloud. I've spent my entire career winning. Accumulating victories, accumulating wealth, accumulating a reputation for being unbeatable. But today, lying in that alley, all I could think about was my daughter. About how she'll remember me, if she remembers me at all, as someone who was never there. Someone who chose winning over everything else. So don't choose winning, Tasha said simply. It's not that easy. Isn't it? She sat back, studying his face. You're successful enough that you can probably afford to be selective about your cases. Rich enough that you don't have to take blood money from dangerous people. You have choices most people can't even imagine. Her words stung because they were true. Vincent had been telling himself for years that he had no choice, that the pressure of maintaining his lifestyle, his reputation, his position demanded that he take every high-paying case that came his way. But the truth was more uncomfortable. He took those cases because winning them made him feel powerful, important, untouchable. "It's different when you have nothing to lose," he said, immediately regretting the words. Tasha's expression shifted, a flash of something harder crossing her features. "You think I have nothing to lose? That's not what I meant." "No, that's exactly what you meant." She stood up, putting distance between them. "You think because I'm homeless, because I'm undocumented, because I don't have your money or your education or your fancy apartment, that I have nothing worth protecting." Vincent realized he had stumbled into something deeper, more painful than he understood. "Tasha, I'm sorry. I didn't." "You didn't think," she interrupted. "You assumed. Just like everyone else assumes that people like me don't have dreams, don't have dignity, don't have things we're fighting for." The anger in her voice was justified, and Vincent felt the shame of recognition. Even in his gratitude, even in his growing admiration for her strength and kindness, he had reduced her to her circumstances. He had looked at her situation and assumed it represented the totality of who she was. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. That was thoughtless and insulting." Tasha studied his face, looking for sincerity. She had heard plenty of apologies in her life, from employers who couldn't afford to keep her, from officials who couldn't help her, from people who wanted to feel better about their own indifference. Most apologies were about making the apologizer feel better, not about acknowledging real harm. But there was something in Vincent's expression, a genuine shame and recognition, that felt different. "I have plenty to lose," she said, sitting back down but maintaining her distance. "I have my integrity, my hope, my belief that tomorrow might be better than today. I have my memories of my grandmother, and the lessons she taught me, and the promise I made to her grave that I would build something good in America." She paused, looking out through a gap in the hedge at the park beyond, where early morning joggers were beginning their routines. "I have the knowledge that when I saw another human being hurt and alone, I didn't walk past. I stopped. I helped. I stayed." She looked back at him. "That matters. It matters more than money or status or safety. It's who I am." The conviction in her voice was absolute, and Vincent felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition, maybe, or an awakening. Here was someone who had lost everything external, yet had retained everything essential. Everything he had given up in his pursuit of external success. "I used to call my daughter every Sunday," he said suddenly. "Even after the divorce, even after the custody arrangement, I called her every Sunday at 7 p.m. We'd talk about her week, her friends, what she was learning in school." "What happened?" "I started missing calls. Important client dinner, emergency at the firm, meeting that ran late. I told myself I'd make it up to her, call during the week, but then the week would get away from me too." His voice grew quieter. "After a while, she stopped expecting my calls. And then I stopped making them, because hearing the disappointment in her voice was harder than dealing with my guilt." "How long since you've talked to her?" 3 months. Tasha was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She thought about the children she had cared for, how they had lit up when she walked in the room, how they had trusted her completely with their secrets and fears and dreams. She thought about how she would have given anything to have her grandmother's voice on the phone one more time, even for 5 minutes. "She's still your daughter," she said finally. "That doesn't change because time passes. She has a stepfather now. A good one, from what I hear. She probably doesn't need. She needs her father." The words came out sharper than Tasha intended. "She might not need your money, might not need you to fix her problems or provide for her daily needs. But she needs to know that her father thinks about her, cares about her, loves her enough to show up." Vincent felt the truth of her words like a physical weight. He had told himself that staying away was noble, that Emma was better off without a father who had already proven his priorities lay elsewhere. But maybe that was just another form of selfishness, choosing his own guilt over her needs. "It might be too late," he said. "For some things, maybe. But not for the important things." Tasha reached into her plastic bag and pulled out a cell phone, not the cracked one she had tried to use in the alley, but an older model that looked like it might actually work. "Call her." Vincent stared at the phone like it was a dangerous animal. "Now. Right now. This moment. Before you can talk yourself out of it." The simple directness of the suggestion terrified him more than the beating had. Physical pain was temporary, manageable. But the vulnerability of reaching out to his daughter, of risking her rejection or indifference, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. What if she doesn't want to talk to me? What if she does? Have you ever avoided reaching out to someone you loved because you were afraid of being hurt? Sometimes the people we think don't need us are the ones who need us most. What's stopping you from making that call you know you should make? Vincent stared at the phone in Tasha's outstretched hand, as if it held the power to either save his soul or destroy what remained of his carefully constructed life. The morning sun had climbed higher, filtering through the hedge and casting dappled shadows across their makeshift shelter. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sounds of Chicago waking up fully, traffic building to its mid-morning rhythm, the distant hum of construction, the occasional laugh of children playing in the park. Normal sounds of a normal day for normal people who hadn't just had their entire world shifted by a beating and a homeless woman with more wisdom than most of his highly educated colleagues. "I don't even know if this number still works," he said, though they both knew he was stalling. Tasha set the phone down between them, not pushing, not withdrawing the offer, just letting it exist as a possibility. Only one way to find out. Vincent's hands were shaking slightly, whether from the beating, the adrenaline crash, or the prospect of talking to his daughter, he couldn't be sure. He picked up the phone, its weight somehow both insignificant and enormous. What do I even say to her? "Hi, honey. Sorry I disappeared from your life. I was too busy making money and winning cases to remember I had a daughter." "You say hello," Tasha said simply. "You ask how she is. You listen to her answer. And if she hangs up on me, then at least you tried. At least she knows you thought about her enough to call." Vincent looked at the phone's cracked screen, seeing his own distorted reflection in the dark glass. He thought about Emma's laugh, how she used to giggle when he would tickle her, how she would run to him when he came home from work, her small arms wrapping around his legs with complete trust and unquestioning love. When had he stopped deserving that trust? "She used to draw pictures of us," he said quietly. "Me and her. Always with me wearing a suit and tie, even in the drawings where we were at the beach or the zoo. She saw me as this formal person, this businessman, even when I was supposed to be her dad." Tasha thought about the children she had cared for, how they had seen her as simply Tasha, not someone with a complicated immigration status or a tragic past, just someone who loved them, played with them, made them feel safe. "Children don't care about suits and ties," she said. "They care about presence, about knowing that someone thinks they're important enough to prioritize." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow because they were so simply, devastatingly true. Emma hadn't needed a perfect father. She had needed a present one. His finger hovered over the phone's keypad. He knew her number by heart, had memorized it when she first got her own phone 2 years ago, back when he still harbored illusions that technology could bridge the growing distance between them. "What if she's changed?" he asked. "What if she's not the same little girl who used to wait for my Sunday calls?" "Then you get to know who she's become," Tasha said. "That's what love is, isn't it? Not loving someone for who they were, but choosing to love who they are now, whoever that turns out to be." Vincent looked at her with something approaching awe. Here was someone who had lost everything, her family, her home, her legal status, her security, yet still spoke about love with such clarity, such certainty. How had she managed to retain such wisdom when his own success had taught him only cynicism? "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you still believe in love, in people, in goodness, after everything you've been through?" Tasha was quiet for a moment, considering the question. She looked out through the gap in the hedge, watching a young mother push her toddler on a swing in the distance. "Because the alternative is giving up," she said finally. "And giving up means they win. The people who hurt us, the systems that try to grind us down, the voices that tell us we don't matter. If I stop believing in goodness, if I stop showing kindness, if I stop hoping for better, then they've won." She turned back to him, her dark eyes fierce with conviction. "My grandmother used to say that every act of kindness is a prayer. Every time we choose love over fear, compassion over indifference, hope over despair, we're praying for the world to be better. And maybe our prayers don't get answered the way we want them to, but at least we don't stop praying." Vincent felt something crack open in his chest, not the physical pain from his injuries, but something deeper. A wall he had built around his heart, brick by brick, case by case, compromise by compromise. For years, he had told himself that cynicism was realism, that expecting the worst from people was just being practical. But looking at Tasha, who had every reason to be cynical, every justification for bitterness, every excuse to be hardened, he saw something he had forgotten was possible. Not naive optimism, but fierce, conscious choice to keep believing in human goodness despite all evidence to the contrary. "You saved me," he said suddenly. "You were just beaten up. You would have been fine." "No." He shook his head. "Not from the alley. From this." He gestured vaguely at himself. "From becoming someone I didn't recognize anymore. Someone my daughter didn't want to know." Before Tasha could respond, Vincent picked up the phone and dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Vincent's heart was beating so hard he was sure Tasha could hear it. On the 4th ring, just as he was preparing to hang up and tell himself he had tried, a voice answered. "Hello." It was Emma, but not the little girl's voice he remembered. This voice was older, more mature. 12 years old now, he realized with a start. No longer a child, but not quite a teenager either. That in-between age when everything was changing, when she needed guidance and stability more than ever. And where had he been during this crucial transition? Winning cases, making money, building a reputation that suddenly felt as substantial as smoke. "Hello," Emma said again, and Vincent realized he had been silent too long. "Emma," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Dad." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Vincent could hear his daughter breathing, could almost feel her processing this unexpected call, deciding how to respond. "Dad." Her voice was smaller now, more uncertain. "Where have you been?" The question was so direct, so painfully honest, that Vincent felt tears prick at his eyes. No accusations, no anger. Just a 12-year-old girl asking her father why he had disappeared from her life. I've been stupid, honey. Really, really stupid." He looked at Tasha, who was watching him with an expression of gentle encouragement. She nodded slightly, urging him to continue. "I thought." Vincent struggled to find words that a 12-year-old could understand, that wouldn't burden her with his own failures and regrets. "I thought you were better off without me around. I thought your mom and stepdad could give you everything you needed, and I was just complicating things." "But I missed you," Emma said, and her voice was so small, so vulnerable, that Vincent had to close his eyes against the pain of it. "I missed you too, baby. Every single day. I didn't know how to tell you that. Why didn't you call?" Vincent looked at Tasha again, drawing strength from her steady presence. "Because I was scared," he said, and it was perhaps the most honest thing he had said in years. "I was scared you wouldn't want to talk to me anymore. Scared you'd forgotten about me. Scared I'd lost the right to be your dad." "You're always going to be my dad," Emma said, and Vincent could hear tears in her voice now. "Even when you don't call. Even when I'm angry at you. You're still my dad." The words broke something open inside Vincent's chest, released a flood of emotion he had been holding back for months. He found himself crying, not the controlled, private tears he had allowed himself during his divorce, but raw, overwhelming sobs that shook his entire body. Tasha reached over and placed her hand on his arm, her touch grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this moment. "I'm sorry," he managed to say to Emma. "I'm so sorry I haven't been the father you deserve." "Are you okay, Dad? You sound different." Vincent looked around at their makeshift shelter, at Tasha's kind face, at the simple fact that he was sitting on a piece of cardboard in a park having the most important conversation of his life. He thought about the beating, about the men who had wanted to teach him a lesson about priorities, about how sometimes the universe had to knock you down before you remembered how to stand up properly. "I think I'm starting to be okay," he said. For the first time in a long time. They talked for 20 minutes. Emma told him about school, about her friends, about the book she was reading for English class. She told him about her stepdad Mike, who was teaching her to play guitar, but was careful to add, his nice, but his not you, Dad. Vincent told her about his work, but not in the way he used to, not about the victories and the money and the reputation, but about helping people, about using his skills to make things better. He found himself talking about cases he had taken pro bono, about times when winning had felt truly meaningful. He didn't tell her about the beating, or about Tasha, or about the crisis that had brought him to this moment. Those were adult complications that she didn't need to carry. Instead, he told her he loved her, that he was proud of her, that he wanted to be a better father. Can we talk again soon? Emma asked as the conversation was winding down. Like, maybe this Sunday? At 7. This Sunday at 7, Vincent promised. And every Sunday after that, if you want. I want, Emma said quickly. I really want. After they hung up, Vincent sat in silence for a long moment, still holding the phone. Tasha didn't say anything, just sat beside him, her presence steady and comforting. She forgave me, he said finally, his voice full of wonder. Children usually do, Tasha said softly. If you give them the chance. Vincent looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the homeless woman who had found him in an alley, but someone who had become essential to his understanding of what mattered. Someone who had shown him grace when he had forgotten how to show it to himself. Why did you help me? He asked. Really? You could have walked away, could have minded your own business, could have protected yourself from getting involved with a stranger's problems. Why did you stay? Tasha considered the question, her fingers absently straightening the edge of the top that served as their roof. When I was 7, she said eventually, I got lost in the market in Port-au-Prince. I was supposed to stay close to my grandmother while she sold her bread, but I saw something interesting and wandered off. When I realized I was lost, I started crying. She paused, remembering. This old woman I had never seen before found me. She was even poorer than we were, I could tell from her clothes, from the way other people looked at her. But she bought me a piece of candy with probably the only money she had, and she walked with me through the entire market until we found my grandmother. Did you ever see her again? Never. She disappeared back into the crowd, and I never even learned her name. Tasha smiled slightly. But my grandmother told me that sometimes angels come disguised as ordinary people, and they show up exactly when we need them most. She said our job isn't to recognize the angels, just to be ready to be one when someone else needs it. Vincent felt something shift inside him, a fundamental reorientation of his understanding of value and purpose. You're the angel, he said. Maybe we both are, Tasha replied. For each other. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning deepen into day around them. Vincent found himself studying their surroundings with new eyes, not seeing poverty and desperation, but seeing ingenuity and resilience and hope. Tasha had created something beautiful from nothing, had maintained dignity in circumstances that would have broken many people. What do you need? He asked suddenly. What do you mean? To fix your immigration status. To get your papers, to get back on your feet. What would it actually take? Tasha looked at him warily. Why? Because I want to help. Because you helped me when I needed it most, and now I want to return the favor. Vincent. Please, he interrupted. Let me do this. Let me be useful for something that actually matters. Tasha was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with pride and pragmatism. She had been on her own for so long, had learned to expect disappointment from well-meaning promises, had built walls around her hope to protect it from further damage. But there was something different about Vincent. Not just his obvious wealth, but his genuine regret about his failures, his real recognition of what she had given him. And maybe, she allowed herself to think, this was how her grandmother's angels worked, not just showing up when you needed them, but creating chains of kindness that rippled outward. A good immigration lawyer would cost at least $5,000, she said finally. Maybe more, depending on how complicated my case is. And there's no guarantee they could fix it. Vincent smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. I happen to know some excellent immigration lawyers. And $5,000. He laughed, shaking his head at the cosmic absurdity of it all. I spend more than that on a single business dinner. You'd really do that? For a stranger? You're not a stranger anymore, Vincent said softly. You're the person who reminded me who I'm supposed to be. Tasha felt tears prick at her eyes. The first tears she had allowed herself to shed since that terrible day when the landlord had given her 24 hours to vacate her apartment. She had trained herself not to hope too much, not to trust too easily, not to believe in rescue that might not come. But sitting here with Vincent, seeing the genuine gratitude and determination in his eyes, she felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. The belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. There's one more thing, Vincent said, his voice growing serious. The men who hurt me, they might come looking. If they see us together, if they think you're somehow involved in my business. You think I'd be in danger? I think they are dangerous people who don't make fine distinctions about who's involved and who isn't. Vincent looked at her with concern that felt almost protective. Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while, until I figure out how to handle this situation. Tasha looked around at her carefully arranged shelter, at the only home she had managed to create in months of uncertainty. The thought of abandoning it, of starting over somewhere new, filled her with a familiar exhaustion. But the thought of those men finding her here, of Vincent being hurt again because of their association, was worse. Where would I go? She asked. Vincent was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised them both. You could stay with me. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. In your penthouse apartment, with your doorman and your marble countertops and your view of Lake Michigan. Tasha shook her head. Vincent, I'm homeless. I don't have the right clothes for your building, the right documentation for your building management, the right. You have the right to be safe, Vincent interrupted. You have the right to be somewhere warm and secure while we figure out the legal stuff. Everything else is just details. People will ask questions. Let them ask. Tasha studied his face, looking for signs of pity or charity or the kind of guilt-driven generosity that would evaporate as soon as it became inconvenient. But what she saw was something else entirely, a recognition, maybe, or gratitude, or the beginning of something that neither of them was ready to name. Why are you doing this? She asked. Vincent thought about the question, about all the possible answers. Because he owed her. Because she had saved his life. Because she had reminded him of what mattered. Because helping her felt like the first meaningful thing he had done in years. All of those were true, but they weren't the whole truth. Because when I was lying in that alley, thinking I might die there, all alone, he said slowly, you were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was praying. And now I want to be that for someone else. For you. When someone shows you unexpected kindness, how do you pay it forward? Have you ever been in a situation where helping someone else helped heal something broken in yourself? Sometimes the people we rescue end up rescuing us right back. 3 months later, Vincent stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, watching the first snow of the season dust the bare branches of the trees in Millennium Park. The view was the same as it had always been, Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon, the city sprawling in all directions like a circuit board come to life. But everything else had changed. Behind him, he could hear Tasha moving around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. It was a sound that had become as essential to his daily rhythm as breathing, though it had taken weeks for either of them to acknowledge that what was happening between them was more than gratitude, more than convenience, more than two people helping each other through a crisis. The transition hadn't been easy. The first night Tasha had stayed in his apartment, she had slept on the couch despite his protests, wrapped in her own thin blanket rather than the expensive linens he offered. She had woken before dawn, as she always did on the streets, her body still programmed for the hypervigilance that kept homeless people alive. I don't belong here, she had whispered that first morning, standing at these same windows in clothes that looked shabby against the apartment's pristine backdrop. Neither do I, Vincent had replied, and surprised himself by meaning it. I've lived here for 5 years, and I've never felt at home. Maybe home isn't about the place. Maybe it's about who you're with. It had taken time to build trust, real trust, not just the crisis-born dependency that had brought them together. Tasha had to learn to believe that Vincent's kindness wasn't temporary, that his offers of help came without hidden strings or eventual expiration dates. Vincent had to learn to see past his own assumptions about what help looked like, what dignity meant, what it cost someone like Tasha to accept assistance from someone like him. The legal battle for Tasha's immigration status had been every bit as complex as she had feared, but Vincent's connections had opened doors that had been firmly closed to a homeless woman working alone. Maria Santos, one of the best immigration attorneys in Chicago, had taken Tasha's case with the kind of attention and resources that money could buy but compassion made meaningful. Her case isn't unusual, Maria had explained during their first meeting. Thousands of people fall through cracks in the system every year. The difference is that most of them don't have someone with the resources and determination to fight the system on their behalf. The legal fees had been more than $5,000, closer to $12,000 by the time all the paperwork was filed, all the appeals submitted, all the bureaucratic obstacles navigated. For Vincent, it was a fraction of what he spent on his car payments. For Tasha, it was a miracle that felt almost too large to accept. But the money had been the easy part. The harder part was helping Tasha rebuild not just her legal status but her sense of self-worth, her belief that she deserved stability and security and love. 3 months of safe shelter, regular meals, and consistent kindness had begun to heal wounds that went deeper than homelessness, deeper than immigration status, all the way back to a 7-year-old girl who had lost everything in an earthquake and had been learning to survive loss ever since. The dangerous men who had beaten Vincent had turned out to be more bark than bite when faced with the full force of law enforcement attention. Vincent's connections in the legal community had ensured that the assault was investigated thoroughly, and the men, who turned out to be mid-level enforcers for an organization that preferred to operate in shadows, were arrested within 2 weeks. The organization itself, faced with the choice between escalating a war with Chicago's legal establishment or cutting their losses, had chosen to fade back into whatever shadows they had emerged from. Vincent's approach to his law practice had changed too. He was still successful, still winning cases, still making money. But now he was selective in ways he had never been before. No more clients whose victories came at the cost of other people's suffering. No more cases that paid well but left him feeling hollow. He had started taking pro bono immigration cases, using his skills to help people like Tasha navigate systems designed to grind them down. "It's like you've remembered why you became a lawyer in the first place," his partner had observed during a recent meeting. "You're still brilliant, still effective. But now you seem to actually care about the outcomes beyond just winning." The biggest change, though, was his relationship with Emma. Their Sunday phone calls had become sacred, inviolable time. No clients, no emergencies, no exceptions. 7 p.m. every Sunday, father and daughter reconnecting across the distance that geography and divorce had created between them. But more than that, Vincent had started showing up. Emma's school play, her soccer games, parent-teacher conferences that he attended alongside her mother and stepfather, all of them focused on what was best for Emma rather than relitigating old grievances. "She's different when you're around," his ex-wife had told him recently. "Lighter, more confident. I forgot how much she lights up when she has your attention." Emma had even started spending alternate weekends at Vincent's apartment, something that had seemed impossible just months ago. She adored Tasha, who treated her with the same gentle attention she had once given the children she cared for as a nanny. "Is Tasha going to be my stepmom?" Emma had asked during one of those weekend visits, the question delivered with the casual directness of a 12-year-old. Vincent and Tasha had looked at each other across the breakfast table, both of them startled by how natural the possibility felt, how right it seemed despite the unconventional way they had found each other. "Would you like that?" Tasha had asked carefully. "Yeah," Emma had said without hesitation. "She makes you happy. And she makes really good pancakes." The proposal, when it finally came, had been as unconventional as their entire relationship. They were back in Millennium Park, visiting the maintenance shed where Tasha had created her makeshift home. She had wanted to see it again, to remember where she had come from, to mark how far they had both traveled. The space looked smaller now, less carefully arranged. Someone else had claimed it, had spread their own belongings in the sheltered corner, their own small attempt at creating home from nothing. "I hope they stay safe here," Tasha had murmured, looking at the new occupant's sleeping bag, the plastic bags of carefully organized possessions. "We could help them," Vincent had said. "Find them a lawyer, get them connected to services, offer them what you offered me." "What did I offer you?" Vincent had thought about the question seriously. "Hope," he had said finally. "You offered me hope when I had forgotten it was possible." It was then, standing in that forgotten corner of the park where they had first trusted each other, that Vincent had pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I bought this weeks ago," he had said, his voice nervous but certain. "I've been carrying it around, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect setting, the perfect words." Tasha had stared at the box, her heart pounding. "But there's nothing perfect about us," Vincent had continued. "Nothing conventional about how we met, how we fell in love, how we saved each other. So maybe this is exactly the right place to ask." The ring had been beautiful but not ostentatious, a simple solitaire that caught the light without demanding attention, elegant without being showy. "Marry me," Vincent had said. "Not because you need saving, and not because I owe you something. Marry me because I love you. Because you make me want to be the man I was supposed to be all along. Because home isn't a place, it's you." Tasha had cried then, tears of joy and relief and wonder that her life could have led to this moment, this choice, this possibility of a future that included not just survival but happiness. Yes, she had whispered. Yes, yes, yes. The wedding had been small, held in Vincent's apartment with views of the lake and the city stretching beyond. Emma had been Tasha's maid of honor, beaming with pride as she held the rings. Vincent's sister had flown in from Denver, initially skeptical about this woman who had entered her brother's life under such unusual circumstances, but won over completely within an hour of meeting Tasha. She's good for you, she had told Vincent privately. I haven't seen you this genuinely happy since before your divorce. Maybe ever. Maria Santos, the immigration lawyer, had attended with her husband, celebrating not just a wedding but a legal victory. Tasha's permanent residency had been approved, her path to citizenship clear and secure. Most of my cases don't end like this, Maria had said during the reception. Most of them end with forms and fees and official stamps. But sometimes, rarely, they end with love stories. Now, 6 months after their wedding, Vincent stood at his familiar windows watching the snow fall, marveling at how completely his understanding of wealth had changed. He still lived in the same apartment, still drove expensive cars, still had more money than most people could spend in a lifetime. But his true riches were measured differently now. In the sound of Tasha's laughter echoing from the kitchen. In Emma's weekend visits, when the apartment filled with the chaos and joy of a 12-year-old who felt truly welcome. In the satisfaction of using his legal skills to help people who needed advocacy more than they needed another corporate victory. In the knowledge that when someone had needed help, he had chosen to stay rather than walk away. Dinner's ready, Tasha called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warmth that had become the soundtrack of his happiest days. Vincent turned from the window, leaving behind the view of the city and the lake and the park where his life had been forever altered by a woman's kindness. He walked toward the kitchen, toward the smell of something delicious cooking, toward the sound of his wife humming while she worked. Tasha looked up as he entered, her smile bright and welcoming. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she had worn that first day in the alley. But everything about her radiated contentment, security, the particular glow of someone who had found her place in the world. Emma called while you were on your conference call, she said, handing him a glass of wine. She wanted to remind you about her concert next week. I wouldn't miss it, Vincent said, and meant it completely. I know, Tasha replied, and the simple certainty in her voice was worth more than any legal victory he had ever won. They sat down to dinner at the table by the window, the city lights beginning to twinkle as darkness settled over Chicago. Vincent reached across the table to take Tasha's hand, marveling as he always did at the strength in her fingers, the resilience written in every line of her palm. What are you thinking about? She asked, catching him staring. Just this, he said, gesturing to encompass everything. The apartment, the dinner, the two of them sitting together as snow fell outside. How different everything is from 6 months ago. Different how? Vincent considered the question, thinking about the man he had been before that October morning when 3 strangers had beaten him unconscious in an alley. Successful, yes. Wealthy, certainly. But empty in ways he hadn't even recognized until Tasha had shown him what fullness looked like. Before, I had everything I thought I wanted, he said slowly. Now I have everything I actually need. Tasha squeezed his hand, understanding without explanation. She thought about the young woman who had pushed a broken shopping cart through the early morning streets, carrying all her possessions and none of her hopes. That woman had believed she had nothing to offer anyone, least of all a successful businessman who lived in a world of expensive suits and important meetings. She had been wrong about what she had to offer, and he had been wrong about what he needed most. Sometimes I think about that morning, she said, about what would have happened if I had kept walking, if I had minded my own business, stayed invisible like I was supposed to. But you didn't. No, Tasha smiled. I didn't. And look what happened. Vincent lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles softly. You saved my life. We saved each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in clean white possibility. In the distance, Vincent could see Millennium Park, where a maintenance shed held memories of desperation and hope, where 2 strangers had discovered that kindness was the most powerful force in the universe. Where everyone else had walked past, but love had chosen to stay. Emma would visit next weekend, filling the apartment with laughter and questions and the particular chaos of a teenager discovering her place in a complicated but loving family. Maria Santos would call with updates on other cases, other people whose lives could be transformed by the combination of legal expertise and genuine compassion. Vincent's law practice would continue to evolve, becoming something that fed his soul as well as his bank account. But tonight, there was this, a simple dinner shared between two people who had learned that home wasn't a place but a choice, that wealth wasn't measured in possessions but in connections, that sometimes the greatest rescue came disguised as an ordinary moment of human decency. Vincent and Tasha finished their dinner as the snow painted Chicago white, two people who had found each other at exactly the moment when they most needed to be found. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, millions of people rushing past each other, focused on their destinations, their ambitions, their carefully constructed lives. But here, in this warm apartment with its view of endless possibility, love had created something lasting. Something that began with one person choosing not to walk past another's pain, and grew into proof that kindness, given freely and received gratefully, could transform everything. In the end, it was exactly as Tasha's grandmother had said. Sometimes angels come disguised as ordinary people, and they show up exactly when we need them most. The job isn't to recognize the angels, but to be ready to be one when someone else needs it. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, being an angel for someone else teaches us how to be human again ourselves. Think about the last time someone showed you unexpected kindness when you needed it most. How did that moment change you? Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion create the biggest transformations. Share a story about a time when someone's kindness changed your life, or when your kindness changed someone else's. Because these stories remind us that we all have the power to be someone's angel, one ordinary moment at a time.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.